Okay, and so we're looking at Operation Enduring Freedom, which is a consequence of the Bush Doctrine, which is the global war on terror, which is going to be initiated from the September 11th attacks. And so in order to understand Operation Enduring Freedom or the war in Afghanistan, which is still going on to a little bit, there's few American troops over there still, we have to look at who the players are. And so we already understand who Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden are from our last lesson, but who is taking care of them and allowing them to operate in Afghanistan? That's going to be the Taliban. Everyone's heard of the Taliban. The Taliban was an Islamic fundamentalist group which took control of Afghanistan in 1998 after being funded and supported by Pakistan. The Taliban enforce a very strict interpretation of Islam and don't allow women to go to school, show their faces, children can't fly kites, etc., etc. The Taliban are going to invite bin Laden to live in Afghanistan after bin Laden was exiled from Sudan. Okay, and so here's a picture of women who can't show their face in Afghanistan under Taliban rule. Here's a picture of the Taliban probably getting ready to cut some guy's head off. And here is bin Laden meeting members of the Taliban. Okay, so in Operation Enduring Freedom of Afghanistan, we're going to invade Afghanistan October 7th, 2001. It's pretty quick after the attacks. Our goals, our mission, is to capture Osama bin Laden, destroy the Al-Qaeda network, and remove the Taliban regime which is protecting them. Here's some pictures of combat and other stuff. Continued. So, George W. Bush announces that airstrikes have begun in Afghanistan on major Al-Qaeda and Taliban infrastructure. United States Special Forces, along with Northern Alliance Afghans, direct bombs on Taliban and Al-Qaeda soldiers with devastating effects. And so, if you look at this picture right here, this is going to direct a laser. That's an American. And he looks like he's dressed like an Afghan, so that Afghans who see him, Taliban who see him, don't know if he's American or Afghan. Anyways, with this device, he can see from long distances, and it's going to fire a laser, direct a laser, which is going to drop ordnance on the Taliban, which we're going to see in a very short while. On December 7th, 2001, Kandahar, the last remaining Taliban stronghold, falls as American and Northern Alliance troops enter the city. And this dude right here, Hamid Karzai, was installed as the interim president and would continue to be president for many years later, which if I'm pretty sure he might even still be president to this day. But let's go ahead and look at some hard footage of this. And so this is going to be America's response to 9/11. Okay, kind of a timeline. It's 9 minutes long, but it's well worth it.
October 19th, on a moonless night, U.S. ground forces draw first blood in Afghanistan. Under the direction of the President, Special Operations Forces, including U.S. Army Rangers, deployed to Afghanistan. They attacked and destroyed targets associated with terrorist activity and Taliban command and control. It's a highly visible show of force, grabbing for just a few minutes a lightly guarded command post and airfield 60 miles from Kandahar. It is, in part, a diversion. That same night, 300 miles to the north, two Special Forces A-teams, each with about a dozen men, are secretly dropped onto remote mountainsides to establish the U.S. military's first contact with a group of Afghan warlords. They are known as the Northern Alliance and have been fighting the Taliban for years. Only now are these American soldiers telling their stories. Most still insist we not use their full names to protect their families from possible retribution.
Everybody knew as soon as I stepped off that helicopter, he just made history. Like, man, I can't believe I'm doing this.
I initially thought we may have bit off more than we could chew, because if you got in any type of trouble, you weren't getting away. There's nowhere to go.
Some Alpha team's going up to the top, Bravo team's staying back.
It is the beginning of an amazing military operation, fought mostly in the shadows by soldiers who grow beards and dress like natives to protect themselves. What they accomplish will repeatedly surprise both the enemy and American commanders. While the president was willing to send tens of thousands of troops if necessary, the goal was to try to fight this war with just a few hundred American soldiers on the ground. They would work with scattered bands of Afghan militia, trying to forge them into an army strong enough to topple the Taliban regime.
We are facing somewhere in the the magnitude of 50 to 60,000 opposition fighters of all flavors and stripes that included Taliban and Al-Qaeda.
Colonel John Mulholland ran the operation from a base just outside Afghanistan.
We very much understood that this could be a very, very difficult fight against a tenacious foe.
These elite U.S. troops have never set foot in Afghanistan.
Helicopter, Pakistan.
They do not know the languages or the leaders. Only a handful of CIA operatives are on the ground ahead of them. But these soldiers, mostly Army Special Forces, make an immediate impression on skeptical Afghan allies. What they have is a direct link to American air power.
We were like, where do you want the bombs? And they're like, yeah, right, like you'd have a plane here in 10 minutes. 10 minutes later, a plane was coming overhead, dropping bombs on them. You want to talk about immediately establishing rapport with these people.
November 5th. Just 17 days after U.S. soldiers arrive, the first major offensive of the war begins, high in the mountains south of the strategically important town of Mazar-e Sharif.
The terrain was so forbidding and high, you simply couldn't cross it with vehicles, so we wound up moving on horseback alone with small donkeys carrying American equipment.
Sitting on mountain ridges a mile or less from the enemy, special operations teams using lasers and GPS coordinates begin calling in airstrikes, methodically shredding the Taliban front line. It turns into a rout, a mixture of modern and medieval.
They are amongst the bravest people I've ever seen. You see guys walking along ridge lines in the snow with no shoes to go to a fight and have one magazine of ammunition. That tells you something about their level of commitment.
November 10th. That commitment pays off. After 5 days of intense fighting, Mazar-e Sharif falls. News of this victory energizes anti-Taliban forces across the north, who have spent years sitting in trenches begging the U.S. for help. By now, half a dozen Afghan factions in the north have been joined by American teams. There are still only 75 U.S. soldiers on the ground. November 13th. In one incredible 24-hour period, just 3 days after the collapse of Mazar-e Sharif, 3 major cities fall. Herat in the west, Tahlequan in the north, and finally the capital, Kabul.
And we pretty much continuously bombed 24 hours a day. As soon as one left, another one come in. Sometimes we'd have them stacked up 7 deep, just bombing.
November 14th. The day after Kabul falls, the U.S. sends its first small team into the mountains of the south, near the town of Tarin-Kaut. This is where the Taliban has its roots and greatest strength. The team is to help a Pashtun tribal leader named Hamid Karzai, who, unlike other warlords, has no army.
We wouldn't have been able to fight with them on our own. There were about 1,000 Taliban troops, Arabs and non-Arabs and everybody else with them, and about 100 vehicles that they had. And we didn't even have 10 vehicles, all of us together.
November 17th. U.S. aircraft being directed by American soldiers with Karzai rain bombs on Taliban attackers. Karzai's small force takes the town of Tarin-Kaut, the first Taliban defeat in the south.
That really cemented both our rapport with the local Afghanis, and I think it also established Hamid Karzai as both the leader of the people and as a military leader.
November 25th. After their sweeping victories in the north, anti-Taliban forces surround the city of Kunduz. It falls, creating the largest mass surrender of the war, but it almost leads to a disastrous setback.
It was difficult to convince our counterparts that these soldiers need to be disarmed, searched, segregated.
The prisoners, mostly Al-Qaeda, are trucked to an old fortress near Mazar-e Sharif, but not all of them are disarmed. As CIA agent Mike Spann and Special Forces begin interrogating them, suddenly there is gunfire. Spann is killed. and a bloody 3-day gun battle erupts. Most of the Al-Qaeda fight to the death.
I think we're all a little bit amazed at the tenacity that they had displayed and the skill. It would have been a catastrophic blow, at least at that time, had Mazar-e-Sharif been recaptured by the Taliban.
The prison revolt is put down, with U.S. airstrikes pounding the prison fortress. Hundreds of Al-Qaeda and Taliban die. Remarkably, one surviving prisoner is an American citizen, John Walker Lynn. This is the last major battle of the North. December 9th. After 4 days of heavy fighting, Kandahar finally falls. Hamid Karzai, now interim president, enters the city.
People wanted to get in on the fun of the parade, or just to see Mr. Karzai, or be a part of this momentous event. And so by the time we entered Kandahar, it was over a 100-vehicle convoy. It was just a madhouse.
Kandahar is the last major city in Afghanistan to fall. The U.S. still has fewer than 200 special operations troops scattered across the country. 1,000 Marines recently arrived have not yet been called upon for any major battles. It turned out that destroying the Taliban was the easy part. Finding Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda leadership turned out to be a much more difficult task. But in less than 2 months, the Taliban army had been destroyed and the Taliban government replaced with transitional leaders eager to work with the West.
You should be down like this.
Never before had special operations teams played such a huge role in an American war. They turned ragged bands of Afghan militia into a conquering army. What these U.S. soldiers did promises to reshape how America goes to war for decades to come. John McWethy, ABC News.
Okay, so that's basically a rough synopsis of what happened with Operation Enduring Freedom, at least at the beginning, okay? And then, okay, and so this video that I'm going to show right now is going to give you a little bit more insight of what's happened in the past few years. So let's look at this. I need to close, move this out of the way. Where you at? Boom. All right. 3 minutes long. Here you go.
In September 2015, the Taliban captured the city of Kunduz in Afghanistan, marking their biggest victory since the United States invaded the country in 2001. Since being ousted, the Taliban insurgency has been slowly regaining power. So how has the Taliban survived the war on terror? Well, the Taliban in Afghanistan was originally born out of Pakistan's Inner Services Intelligence Agency, which trained, funded, and equipped the terrorist organization. In 1996, the Taliban seized the Afghan capital of Kabul and instituted an Islamic theocratic dictatorship. The reign was marked by human trafficking, brutality towards women, and massacres of civilians. They ruled until 2001, when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan following the attacks of September 11. The orchestrator of the attacks and founder of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, was thought to be harbored by the Taliban government. The U.S. invasion ousted the Taliban government, pushing hundreds of fighters and commanders into hiding in northern Pakistan. Over the next few years, former members regrouped into an insurgency and by 2006 were fighting full force against the U.S.-backed Afghan government. As a terrorist group, the Taliban primarily targeted Afghan civilians, accounting for more than 3/4 of civilian deaths. Hundreds of suicide bombings killed Afghan and NATO troops as the Taliban continued to regain followers and influence. In 2010, the Taliban launched a massive offensive against occupying forces alongside Pakistani and Afghan tribal groups. The strong push saw the Taliban re-enter a number of cities, including the recently captured Kunduz. The Taliban's longtime leader, Mohammed Omar, died in 2013, a fact which was hidden until 2015. The newly appointed leader, Mohammed Mansour, favored peace talks with Afghan forces, but a portion of the Taliban rejected any peace agreement with foreign forces and wanted to continue fighting for what the Taliban calls their version of an Islamic state. Today, despite growing influence and the capture of Kunduz, Taliban leaders have promoted the idea of peace talks in order to get foreign forces out of Afghanistan. Although the U.S. troop drawdown has seen the total number drop from about 100,000 to 10,000, Afghan forces have struggled to maintain power. Afghanistan's stability